Much too long. And I'm glad to say that I'm home. I'm home to stay. Africa, to feel my people's home, to shelter beneath your trees, to catch the summer breeze. Africa, Africa, come Hello, hello. Welcome to the Pan-African Activist Sunday School. It's so wonderful to be here with you once again. We thank you for your patience with us, with trying to coordinate across time zones and continents. We have run into some technical difficulties, but we're glad to be getting started now. Nanre, would you like to start us off?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this space. Again, apologies. Technology has not been on our side today. Struggling in 3 different countries with networks and all kinds of tech difficulties. But we're so happy to be here today and to welcome you into this space, which has become just a wonderful and engaging space over the last 3 sessions. And we're so excited to bring you this session here today. to learn from South African resistance and from the amazing organizers, activists, and freedom fighters from South Africa. So we have a wonderful panel of people to speak here with you today. And we're just excited to welcome you. If you haven't been to the Sunday school before, well, just a brief history. The Pan-Africanist Activist Sunday School was actually formed when activists and organizers came together during the NSARS protest. And we were mainly activists in the diaspora, but also activists in Nigeria. And we began to talk about, well, how could we really make contributions? And how could we really assist activists who are on the ground trying to organize? And so we came up with the idea of this Pan-Africanist Sunday School that would help activists learn from each other about their strategies, their experiences, and just really be a source of solidarity and Pan-Africanist solidarity, and a way in which we can engage and support each other, even from a distance. So back over to you, Crystal, if there's anything you want to say before we introduce the session. Or I think you will introduce the session.
Well, it's just to reaffirm the urgency of us reigniting the Pan-African solidarities and direct connections across our struggles in this moment. I think what NSARS showed us, as we've seen many times in recent years, is that much of what we're facing, regardless of, the particular form it takes, has the exact same roots. And this is one of the reasons why Pan-African solidarity and struggle has been so important to Black people, African people around the world's freedom fight. And we know and understand very deeply that we must unite and we must learn from one another, and we must share our knowledge, our histories, and our understandings with each other if we are to win. And so if you are tuning in for the first time, we had a wonderful first Pan-African Activist Sunday School session 3 weeks ago, maybe, and it was on NSARS and the history of Nigerian activism. You can watch it on all of the platforms that people are watching on right now. It's archived there. We had a second session that was wonderful on the struggle to defund the police in the United States today and how that fits into a larger history of Pan-African struggle. And now we are turning to South Africa, which so many people have looked to for many decades as a real source of inspiration as it pertains to principled struggle, as it pertains to understanding holistically the source of African people's ills and how to work towards defeating them. And so we've got a really wonderful panel of organizers who come from many parts of the movement, many parts of the struggle in South Africa, who have decades of experience in resistance and community organizing work, and who bring a really rigorous and deep understanding of how we can move through the struggle and ultimately how we can win. And so we're so excited to open this up and hear directly from our comrades in South Africa. So in order to do that, we are going to introduce one of our moderators for the day, who is actually going to be co-moderating with me the first panel. And I am so excited to bring back Tone, who is a Pan-Africanist who is dedicated to strategic organizing work. She has several years of experience in analytics and financial strategy. She organizes with a number of community groups and is a core member of Black Lives Matter Boston and the Boston Jobs Coalition. She leads a virtual class on political education and is a cultural curator and community economic justice advocate. So welcome back, Tone. It's so great to see you. And we are excited to get started with our speakers. Incidentally, I don't even think we introduced ourselves, Nanre. Maybe that's something we should rectify before we transition.
Sure. So my name is Nanre. I'm an organizer. I live in, I'm a Nigerian American. I'm with the Afro-Socialist Caucus, Afro-Socialist and Socialist of Color Caucus with the Democratic Socialist of America. I'm also a member of the 320 Coalition, and I organize also in Nigeria with the Socialist Workers Party and Youth League. I'm very excited to be here today, and I just wanted to also add that growing up South Africa and the South African struggle, growing up in Nigeria was so much a part of my life and our lives, just being part of so many things. So I'm so excited to really reconnect to learning more about how the movement has evolved and ways in which people are engaging today. And I think it's a very important connection actually between Nigeria and South Africa. Nigeria played a very huge role in fighting against the apartheid in South Africa during the 90s and in the 80s and all through. Thank you.
Yes, and I'll also just briefly introduce myself. I'm Crystal Strong. I am a core organizer with Black Lives Matter Philly and the Black Philly Radical Collective. I'm also a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and have for more than 15 years been doing research and working with mainly youth and student organizers in Nigeria. And also, similar to Nanre, the connections between South Africa and the United States have been so instrumental just in my own understanding of Black people's struggle around the world. And so I expect that we will hear so many of those resonances as we move through our conversation today. So let's turn it over to Tone, who will help us to introduce our first speaker.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nanre and Crystal, for that wonderful introduction. And I am so happy to be here with Crystal to collaborate in this section. Part one of this series today will focus on anti-apartheid to Black consciousness. As Crystal mentioned, her and I will be leading this section. Our first speaker will be Ophelia Kunani, a mother, activist, writer based in Soweto. She's worked with Keep Left, a revolutionary socialist organization that believes in workers' control of society and the means of production. She's the co-founder of that, acknowledges the connection between the exploitation and denigration of the natural world and of the subordination of women. Today, she'll be discussing ecofeminism and global factors that affect movement. This topic will focus on how environmental issues, climate change, and gender intersects and are necessary to consider in building sustainable social movements. Without further ado, Ms. Kunane, please join us.
Thank you so much, Tone. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I just hope that everyone can hear me. I'm very sorry for the background noise. I'm having trouble with a bit of load shedding at home, so I had to rush somewhere quickly so I can actually join you guys. So before I start this conversation, I think one thing that is important for me to start with is to give a bit of background about what ecofeminism is. And why do I actually call myself an ecofeminist? I'm going to be giving a bit of a background in terms of the work that I've been doing in South Africa, in terms of my writings, but as well as organizing with grassroots women in South Africa. So ecofeminism is a combination of ecology and feminism. We see a connection between the exploitation and degradation of the natural world and the subordination and oppression of women. When it comes to the environmental damage or climate change or climate-related disaster, gender plays a role. Who will be affected and how will they be affected plays a role. You know, with environmental conditions, with the recent environmental conditions, impacts of how the environment impacts women in South Africa, it's different to how it impacts men. As a result of pre-existing inequalities, gender roles often create differences in the ways men and women act in action to the environment. And in these ways, men and women are enabled from acting as agents of environmental change. We seek to address the inherent inequalities in the world structures which permits the North from dominating the South, men from dominating women, and the looting of resources from inequality distributed economical gain to dominate nature. I think I should just bring it a bit back home. In South Africa, a platinum miner would need to work for 93 years just to earn an average of a CEO's annual bonus. In this context, where two of the richest people have the same wealth as the bottom half of the population, this extreme inequality arguably emerges out of a turn towards neoliberal policies, which have resulted in increases of poverty and little security for the Black working class. This causes, obviously, this in turn influences the burden of working class women in South Africa. Working class women in South Africa are accurately vulnerable to ecological devastation. Working class African women shoulder the twin burdens of providing livelihood in a context of high unemployment and limited access to land, and ensuring that daily and generational survival of their households and communities. South Africa is in a state of ecological crisis. This is not different from the rest of the world. A pattern of environmental racism, which I think all these movements have together. The key issue is racism, and this racism is a buildup of different systems evolving into the next system, but at the end of the day, oppressing the black working class. So a pattern of environmental racism continues despite the democratic constitutional proclaiming the right of all to live in an environment that is not harmful to health or the well-being of people. Millions of South Africans, millions of poor working class South Africans are exposed to slow violence of toxic pollution, and this process is very slow and largely invisible. So these are issues that are not even tackled. That this pollution that is in the air is actually cutting down the lifespan of the Black working class, and this is where environmental racism steps in, where many South Africans continue to live on damaged land and polluted neighborhoods, often joining working or abandoned mines, which also obviously exposes them to more danger. And without, these are without adequate resources of refuse removal, water, electricity, and sanitation. In the Gauteng province alone, over 1.6 million people live either adjacent to the mine or in mining conditions. And these conditions are contaminated with uranium, with toxic health metals, including arsenic, aluminium, and manganese, and mercury. And this is a build-up from even apartheid, where dump from suburbs would be taken to townships as to be dumped where people lived. And this is obviously a build-up. The pollution that's also in the air is also a build-up from all of those years, and a strong theme about ecofeminism has with all these problems that are emerging under climate change and how climate change affects women. There has been a very large resistance to ecological devastation in South Africa. And other parts of the global south, where we're seeing a strong theme of African ecofeminism, where women are taking the lead and fighting environmental injustice. Let's just look at activists who their activism was against genetically modified products such as wheat and maize. This highlights not only the profit-driven of big food companies, but it also shows how everyday consumption of these products harm nature and human bodies. And it's important to highlight this because it's also creating, environmental awareness that climate change is real and climate change is something that we need to tackle right now. In many working class struggles, we're seeing a pattern moving away from a point of production to the terrain of social production. Much collective effort or collective action is framed as protest about service delivery and environmental justice, confronting the lack of access to material conditions necessary for social production, such as clean water, clean air, adequate housing, and land for sustenance and agriculture. Women constitute the majority of people working to protect nature from the pollution and devastation driven by the logic of capitalism, which is also something that's common among these movements, that we're trying to fight the same devil, which is capitalism. Capital's externalization of environmental costs frequently involves damage of nature, such as polluted water and degraded land. It is women, through their role of social production, who have to deal with these impacts in communities. It is women who have to work harder in caring for those sick from polluted water. It is women who have to work harder and walk further to obtain clean water and cultivate food crops on damaged land. And as I'm touching on this, I think it's also quite important to look at what has been happening, especially in the environmental movement in South Africa. The women of Kolobeni. Kolobeni is a village in the wild coast of South Africa. These women are fighting against titanium mining. And there's also, women of Somkele, where Comrade Fikile was brutally murdered because she was standing up to fight mining companies. These mines have led to cracks in homes, surrounding communities due to the blasting and illness from the coal dust that penetrates the air. Women are involved in these struggles because of their role in social production. And this does not mean that women are issued this role or take up this role because of the direct connection to nature, but it's because of how everything was socialized that they find themselves in these social roles. And these social roles means that they have to directly deal with damaging effects of polluted water and air, crop failure, and they also have to deal with extreme weather events associated with climate change. And also this possesses an extra burden on unpaid work for women. Working class Black women are active and are often driving environmental and social justice initiatives, confronting climate change, sometimes in survivalist defensive ways, but also in challenging neoliberal capitalism and promoting alternatives such as food sovereignty and energy accessibility and agroecology. It is largely women who are participating in food sovereignty, which involves working with nature through agroecology instead of the reliance of harmful pesticides and chemicals as industrial agriculture. These women are the shock absorbers of climate change in South Africa, experiencing the devastation impacts of rising food prices, water pollution, energy poverty. Many of these women organizational initiatives are building, counter power. We can also look at, another organization in South Africa called the Pink Panther Movement. It focuses on climate change, the impact of coal, especially on food security, the cost of electricity, and the dangers of nuclear power. And it is empowering grassroots women and focusing on education, on the impact of climate change and struggles in South Africa. All these struggles have one thing in common. These forms of all these different forms of struggles are focused on opposing activism and dispossession, as poor communities lose their land through mining and livelihood. And also, I can also give you another example of the Still Valley community. It was once a very productive agricultural community near Van der Bijl Park. The externalization of environmental costs by a steel mill involved discharging contaminated water into the Anlin Dam, which led to the toxic pollution of groundwater, of which lives and livelihood depended on. Crops failed, animals died, and a survey about 500 residents revealed that the pollution somehow over time resulted in genetic defects with cancer and kidney failures, and these are in working class communities. This is the buildup of environmental racism. And this is also why it's so important that we really need to address the issue of climate change. But there was also a social breakdown as social bonds and relations of sorry, and relationships and mutual relationships of mutual aid were weakened. So all of these sicknesses were coming up in these communities, but there wasn't enough aid to address the sicknesses, and this is all because of toxic pollution and also toxic groundwater, which is also imposing an extra burden on unpaid work in communities, unpaid work of women in communities. I think there is, a strong growth of women showing leadership in the environmental struggles. But I also think that the problem that most activists are experiencing globally is that the minute any movement has an identified leader, it's either there's a threat of these leaders being gunned down and killed. And I think this has been so popular, particularly in regards to ecofeminism and in regards to the climate movement, where leaders are targeted. If they are women, they are threatened with rape and they are threatened with death. And those are some of the common or similar traits that we are seeing globally. That whenever movements have some sort of identified leader, they do experience such challenges. I think I would just like to end there. I hope that I was quite clear and everyone managed to hear me clearly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Athalia, for a really riveting presentation. You did such a beautiful job of showing the connections between capitalism and class exploitation and class struggles in South Africa, as well as patriarchy and how that is embedded within capitalist exploitation and specifically women's exploitation. And finally, thinking through what this means for our planet, right? Our environmental conditions, our ability to sustain ourselves as a species. And so you've given us so much to think of. There were several comments with individuals who were interested in learning more about eco-feminism and what that means. So hopefully in the Q&A, we'll have an opportunity to learn more from you about this very important concept and construct to your work. So thank you. We now are going to invite our second speaker. And I am quite pleased to introduce Asher Gamedze, who is a cultural worker based in Cape Town, South Africa, who is working as a musician, a student, a writer, an organizer, and an educator. And if that wasn't enough, Asher is a part of the Interim Collective, which is an autonomous space in Cape Town for cultural work, education work, political meetings, and performance. And it is in this space that they host the People's Library and a variety of popular education sessions in collaboration with social movements and radical scholars. And so I'm very pleased for us all to hear from Asher, who will be talking about Black consciousness and political in Black community programs in South Africa from a historic, but also a contemporary perspective. So welcome, Asher. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to share with us today.
Thanks a lot, Crystal, and greetings, comrades, to wherever people are in the world. I'm coming at you live and direct from Egypt, where I came to spend a few months at teaching at an autonomous college in Cairo. So as Crystal mentioned, I'm going to try potentially slightly ambitiously within 10 minutes to do a little bit of thinking around the ideas of Black consciousness as they emerge in South Africa in the late 60s and 70s, and the manifestation of those ideas in Black community programs. And then I guess try to ask some questions or think about, the moment that we're in now, and the ways in which I think many people are seeing or feeling that protest as a mode of resistance in many ways seems to have reached its limit in certain senses. And so to think about BC and Black community programs as one potential, mode of organizing going forward, and a way also to support and build solidarity between places. So that's broadly what I'm going to try and speak to today. And yeah, so I'll start with some of the history, and I think it's important to remember how BC emerges in South Africa, and part of that context is the intense repression in South Africa that happens from the early 60s onwards. So after Sharpeville massacre, which happens in 1960, there's a massive crackdown on activists and organizers associated with the major liberation movements. And most of those movements either go underground or into exile, or members are incarcerated or executed. And Black consciousness movement emerges at the end of that decade in a time where there's really kind of a political vacuum of above ground Black political activity. And obviously initially, well, not obviously, but initially it's formulated by a lot of people who find themselves in universities, but also drawing on what had been going on in the cultural scene through that decade. So in music and in theater, and extending those ideas and those practices, and kind of crystallizing them into the theoretical and philosophical aspects of Black consciousness. And I think some of the central aspects of Black consciousness as it emerges there, and I think in what manifests later in Black community programs, is this idea of a rejection of the logic of race, right? As a valid category. So a rejection of white supremacy as that through which we understand and construct ourselves as people. So the idea of Black, emerging as this political identity, which has the possibility of uniting those of us oppressed by white supremacy in some form of united front against it. And I think it's this formulation of Black in a South African context, which attempts to create solidarity between people who are racialized differently, whether in the 60s that be people categorized as colored, as African, as Indian. It's an attempt to refuse the political segregation of the Black community. And I think this is one of the things that in many ways in the post-apartheid period, it seems like this idea of Black has been eroded in many ways, and there's been a kind of codification and a hardening of apartheid kinds of categories of identity. So Black being used as way more of a racialized category, as well as colored and Indian, rather than the imagination of it in Black, right, which is an autonomous articulation of ourselves, a positive identification of ourselves. And I think as much as it's an opposition and an antagonism to white supremacy, it's also the wish and desire to articulate a version of ourselves outside of its kind of realm of thinking and possibility. And I think this is the aspect of BC that manifests itself in Black community programs. So in the early 70s, the three main, I mean, I think there were many, but three of the main Black consciousness movement organizations were obviously SASO, South African Students Organization, which was the kind of originary think tank, if you will, of the ideas, and then Black community programs and Black People's Convention, which was more of a political vehicle. But I wanted to think about Black community programs, which were basically an attempt to autonomously create a space to support Black communities and Black people in a way that was organized by activists and community members. So there were projects like clinics and hospitals where people would be treated, with more dignity than if they went to a state hospital, which was probably staffed by, racist white doctors and a form of bureaucracy and admin that was completely dehumanizing. So the idea, I think, the way that this BC idea of an autonomous self encapsulated in the idea of Black becomes manifest in Black community programs, I think, is this really interesting way of a manifestation of politics on a ground level that is about, in a similar way to like, the Panthers schools and the feeding schemes. But it's this extension, I think, of the autonomous bent of Black consciousness and the will to provide, for our communities outside of the state, outside of kind of private capital that I've become very I guess interested in my own practice and in terms of this moment that we find ourselves in now as well. And so I think to go back to the history of BC, I think it was in many ways these Black community programs, but also kind of cultural organizations that were started by Black consciousness activists that did a lot of the consciousness work for later eruptions and sort of mass protests that emerge in the mid and late 70s and throughout the 80s, which lead to the demise of at least formal apartheid, So what I'm trying to think about is trying to understand and think about different chapters of political work, cultural work, and how in this contemporary moment, there's so much protest, which is great in many ways. But there's also a way in which, definitely back home, the state has a very kind of well-articulated way of dealing with protest. So if we think about the student movement that emerges in 2015, 2016, a lot of that was very easily crushed, and the Black consciousness, Black feminist and kind of Pan-Africanist ideas that were circulating in that space have almost totally been taken away from the universities or the spaces in the universities that Black students created. And so the way that protest has been dealt with has been has left a lot of movements or a lot of political energy almost without a space to articulate itself in, So I guess my intention of thinking about BC's emergence and Black community programs was to think towards these kinds of autonomous projects as potentially spaces to put political energy into, in terms of building in the next chapter of our political work. And yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just close with one or two things. I was reading this interview with Kathleen Cleaver a few years ago, and she was reflecting on, the moment of BLM's emergence, and they were asking what she thought, and I mean, I think she was a little bit unfair in her response, but she said, where are the feeding schemes? Where are the schools? Where's the autonomous kind of organizing? The day-to-day thing. And I think there is a lot of that going on. But that was something that kind of got me thinking a lot more about how a movement becomes, I guess, grounded in a real way, in an everyday way, and I guess how we move beyond protest and kind of critique towards more positive, autonomous elaborations of this politics. And yeah, just wondering about what time is it on the political clock, and what's the way to be organizing. But yeah, I know I've gone slightly over time, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Asher. That was super helpful to learn from this perspective. I think we've learned a lot about the parallels between movements and also the history, not just from South Africa. I know you described being in Egypt, but from a very worldly perspective. So that was super helpful. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So as we transition, I believe now we're going to have a wonderful section where we have a discussion with Mr. Bufelo. So I would like to, I have the pleasure, I should say, to introduce this speaker. And this will be a discussion with Nanre. But Mr. Bufelo is a South African poet, essayist, social critic, and culture worker and facilitator of worker education and popular education. Mr. Bufelo's activism began in 1980 when he joined Amazon student movement until he was charged and given a 1-year prison sentence in 1987. He has since become one of the most prolific writers, theorists, and activists of the border of Black consciousness movement. Today, he will be discussing Black consciousness as we continue in this discussion today, and how apartheid shaped the movement pre and post 1994. This section will offer a comparison before 1994 apartheid and after 1994 apartheid, the decline or expansion of Black consciousness, how the student movement and movement leadership has evolved. Without further ado, Mr. Bufalo and Nanre will have a discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrades. I think the first point of entry in engaging with the evolution of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, which I prefer to refer to as Azania, is to highlight the fact that at the time of the emergence of the Black consciousness movement, and even before that, there was a general understanding that the convergence between settler colonialism and racial capitalism in South Africa created power and social relations characterized by the totality of white power, which objectified Black life and criminalized the presence and being of Black people in all spheres and facets of life, which therefore required that forms of struggle and organizations in response to settler colonial racial capitalism have to be informed by an understanding that there is an interconnection between social, political, economic, and cultural issues facing Black people, which therefore means that the student movement that emerged understood that its struggles cannot be seen and pursued in isolation from broader social, political, and economic and cultural struggles of Black people. The same apply to the labor movement, the same apply to cultural movement, and even to Black professional organizations that emerged, like the Black Lawyers Association and so on. So in that sense, there was this sense of understanding of the linkage between different sides of struggle. That was important. And a central understanding also, a key factor also is the fact that because the state that we were engaging with was a state that we had no illusion or expectations it will respond creatively and positively to the needs and aspiration of Black people. It made us to explore forms of power outside of the machinery of the state. Fast forward to 1994, there was an illusion created that a neo-colonial state that is an outcome of a reformist agenda that was aimed at surface modification of society will respond creatively to the Black conditions, to the experiences and demands of Black people, which then demobilized the agency that Black consciousness movement prior to 1994 had actually created. So you have what a syndrome that we'll refer to as a Pretoria shall provide syndrome. That society will be moved forward by the state. And unfortunately, we then found ourselves locked in what I call statism, the expectations of looking at power only through within the framework of the state, which demobilized both the individual and collective agency that Black consciousness movement prior to 1994 had actually created, where there was an emphasis, and as the previous speaker have already made an example about the Black community program, an emphasis on self-reliance, on agency of Black people, on Black people exploring and experimenting with ways of having a meaningful life outside of the machinery of the state and creating a counterculture and a counter hegemony to the apartheid state. I think this is something that actually affected the Black consciousness movement. Another thing also that is important is that the way the topic is structured, how apartheid shaped the movement. Right from the beginning, the Black consciousness movement did not see the struggle as a struggle against apartheid, because apartheid is a set of policies that only started in 1948 to consolidate already racialized power and social structures that were established by colonialism. So right from the beginning, we understood the struggle as a struggle against colonialism and as a struggle against racial capitalism. Hence, the principles and policies of the Black consciousness movement was anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, and anti-sexism. So the whole notion of the intersection between racism, colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy within the context of Azania is something that was appreciated very early in the emergence of the Black consciousness movement. I think that is something important to emphasize and highlight. The other issue that we're speaking about that is currently part of the discourse is the fact that after the young generation discovered that their reality in the neo-colonial setup has not changed, the kind of alienation in academic institutions which informed the intervention of SASO, where SASO was able to connect the alienation in educational institutions that jettisoned Black experience, that equated civilization, science, progress, and modernity with whiteness, and equated Blackness with backwardness and barbarism to the overall reality of Black people. So Black students post-1994 find themselves alienated in this institution in the same way that the SASO students felt alienated in the 70s and the 60s. There was then a keen awareness that transformation in South Africa failed specifically because it did not focus on decolonization. That in South Africa, transformation has to take the form of decolonization, democratization, and socialization. That it is not possible to transform society without the project of decolonization, without the project of nationalization and socialization and democratization of both the polity and the economy. So the fees must fall, roads must fall, was both continuity and discontinuity of the traditions of Black consciousness movement. Discontinuity in the sense that the fees must fall movement began to understand that highly hierarchical structures are problematic and began to emphasize on more flexible forms of organization that are free from hierarchy. Now, one of the questions that has been asked is which leadership mode is better? A leaderless movement or a movement that has got leadership? So a point that I've emphasized in my book, Transition from Post-Colonial Illusions to Decoloniality, is that spontaneity and organizations are not necessarily two diametrically opposed processes, but they are complementary processes. So it is not a matter of either spontaneity or organization, but it is important that organization feeds on and is informed by the daily struggles of Black people and is able to be informed by the spontaneous struggles of our people. And then the spontaneous struggles must also draw on from the positives that can be found from organization. For me, it is not a matter of either spontaneity or organization. They are part of one process, and they feed on one another. And when it comes to the issue of leadership, so therefore, it is important to emphasize on participatory forms of organization, to emphasize on participatory democracy, and to challenge highly hierarchical and highly bureaucratic forms of leadership which sap away the power of agency. And for me, the whole concept of vanguardism is at odds with Black consciousness, with its emphasis on agency, on the nexus between structure and agency. And I think I will want to pause here. Those are just my quick reflections for now.
Wonderful. Crystal, you're muted, but that was excellent.
Yes. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation that I want to believe so many people watching learned so much from and deepened their understanding of the ideological and structural conditions in South Africa. And you offered such a clear vision of what needs to be done. And so we actually are going to have our first set of panelists rejoin us so that we can take some questions from the audience, but also some questions that we've prepared for each of you all. And then after we've had some time to discuss across these presentations, we will then hear from another round of speakers. So before we get into questions, I just wanted to highlight a comment or two that I think speaks to the way that people are engaging with the presentations thus far. We had Mohammed identify the important role of surveillance and technology and how that impacts organizing efforts and energy. And that seems like a very important and astute observation, particularly when we see the way state forces mobilize surveillance and technology to really de-radicalize and neutralize movements. But to the comment that I actually want to offer to this conversation for each of your comment, it comes from Val Ojo, who made a comment: what are those things still missing in our struggle to end xenophobic attacks in South Africa? We can't be killing ourselves while we are still fighting to liberate ourselves fully as a continent. Now, so of course, this comment is talking specifically about xenophobia, and I think some of the comments that Asher brought up specifically around the tensions around racial consciousness and Black consciousness. But I think Orthalia also mentioned, just the need for a deepening understanding of how feminist perspectives, the specific effects of patriarchal formations within capitalism, within the struggle, how those are also perhaps something that is missing from the struggle. And I think across the presentations, we've also heard about class consciousness. And so what I like to pose to this group is the first part of this question, which is, what are the things that you think are still missing from the struggle that could be strengthened? And so how about we start with Orthalia?
So I think there's a lot of things that are really missing in our struggle to end, the xenophobic attacks in South Africa, and that directly talks to obviously Black consciousness. I think we're still battling with a lot of self-hate, and part of the reason we are still there is because we never healed. We are a nation that is still bleeding, and we're a nation that still hates ourselves. And I think when we get to a point where we recognize that so much was robbed from us, and that there's so much healing that needs to be done in that process, then I think that.
So unfortunately, I think we may have lost Orthalia. There's been some internet connectivity issues. So while she is rejoining, how about we hear from Asher, please? Oh,
sure,
she's
thank you.
returned. Sorry. She's
So
returned.
sorry about that. I got disconnected. So I think part of the reasons why there's so much that we need to address, because even the concept of democracy in South Africa, I think a lot of people would even agree with me to say, the concept of democracy is a lie. Especially even within eco-feminist mobilizing, we find that a lot of eco-feminists will feel like they see democracy from the side of the road, where it's just on the other side. because you find in many instances in South Africa, a lot of women who suffer the most from climate or disaster, climate-related disasters, are women in squatter camps. And that also shows how they feel the current South Africa is still very unjust towards them. So I think there's still a lot of healing that needs to happen before we can even take anything further. Because, this signs of xenophobic attacks are a direct reflection of how we feel about ourselves as South Africans.
Thank you. Please, Asher, we would love to hear from you.
Thanks. And greetings, comrade Klane. I remember seeing you in Durban a few years ago, so it was great to hear you speak again. And your presentation was great. But I think around xenophobia, I think there has to be an explicit linking of xenophobia to white supremacy in the first instance, and part of that may be an intervention in the language to understand that it's Afrophobia rather than xenophobia, in the sense, because xenophobia could seemingly refer to anyone who is foreign. But if you look at the pattern of attacks and violence in South Africa, German tourists, American white tourists, local white people are not are not those who are attacked in these attacks, right? So there's internal to the how xenophobia is spoken about is there's this complete normalization of the logic of settler colonialism, to the extent that those who own the majority of land and those who are benefiting from the historical structure of South Africa are not even seen to be foreign, right? And so I think that there has to be a broader connection with the colonial project, and as well as I think the ways in which Black South African people understand ourselves so to such a great extent through apartheid categories, which is premised on this idea of further and further dividing the Black community into potentially antagonistic groups. Whether that's between people who are speaking different languages and have been classified as, Zulu and Xhosa, or if it's people who understand themselves now as South African versus someone who understands himself as Zimbabwean. So I think that there's a lot of work to do in terms of the ways in which we're conceptualizing the issue. But it goes to a project of I think conscientization, and I think the study of history is really important, and I think that is linked in many ways to a Black consciousness program, because I think a significant aspect of the program was culturally to understand ourselves as part of a historical process that does not start and end with white supremacy. So part of the Black consciousness, I think, historical agenda is to understand Black people in South Africa as part of, an African history that extends far before any of the borders that we have today were there, and I think, a great aspect of it is this idea of South African exceptionalism, which has to be debunked and critiqued. This idea of South Africa being separate from the rest of the continent, and the roots of that are obviously in, the desires to create a white enclave at the bottom of the continent, and of course the kind of imperialist relationship that South Africa has had to the rest of the continent. So I think a lot of it is on those levels, in terms of South African people understanding ourselves and understanding, for example, I think Nanre was mentioning before that, Nigerian people, public servants, and many people supported the anti-apartheid struggle to such a great degree. And, you know, South African people are never taught that. You know, you only find that out if you know, read in a certain direction. So there's also this way in which there's the ideas and ideals of Pan-Africanism and solidarity have been so thoroughly diluted and kind of co-opted by ideas of you know, a Pan-Africanism that is a neoliberal project that was put forward by people like Thabo Mbeki and others, which really, I think, leaves at us no kind of progressive end to the solution at this time. But I think it's a lot of it has to do with history, history education, and doing that ourselves. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you. I want to just transition a bit to our next question. I think it's really important to understand leaders in this movement and in this time. So our question is, there has been a lot of discussion on like NSARS and the protests being a leaderless movement. And we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement being leaderful. What are the models of leadership that are most relevant for social movements today?
And if I can just add here, I think this really picks up on some of the comments that were made during your initial remarks about the way that having an identifiable leader can actually weaken movements, or the way that the elevation of individual leaders can be a part of this kind of neoliberal, capitalist, white supremacist project. So we're really hoping you might expand briefly on some of these comments and share with us some of what those conversations look like on the ground.
Sorry, I didn't catch who that question was directed to. Sorry.
It is an open question. So if you would like to comment, we welcome your comment.
Any of the other panelists would like to go before me?
Yes.
Please.
I think I did speak earlier about how one of the challenges people have had with our political organizations formation is the predominance of something that is called democratic centralism, which in practice translates into bureaucratic centralism. More often than not, the center is not the membership or the constituency, but the leadership collective that is elected becomes the center. So people will meet at a Congress and give a mandate to the leadership. But through this bastardized concept of democratic centralism, there is this notion that the Central Committee, Executive Committee, or so forth, in between the Congress, can deviate from the mandate of a Congress or General Assembly or whatever, and that the people must then follow whatever the leadership say. So the concept of people collectively as a vanguard is replaced by the concept of a political party as a vanguard. And within the party itself, there is the inner circle that is supposed to think and act on behalf of the people, as if the people cannot think and act for themselves. On the other hand, it is important to have some kind of leadership collective. But for what is important is check balances that ensure that the leadership does not commit certain excesses, that ensure that there's no culture of a messianic cult, or there is no culture of permanent leadership, that ensure that the leadership is held to account by people. Therefore, it is important to explore and experiment with forms of participatory democracy. And participatory democracy only work where there is a higher level of consciousness, where there is a higher level of political education. And if you see the broader social and political movement in South Africa today, political education has dwindled. So I think a great emphasis has to be on political education, has to be on experimenting and exploring different forms of collective leadership, of participatory democracy, of the principles of recall and active participation, where people are able to recall the leadership, where there are different ways in which leaders can be held to account.
Thank you so much for that. And I know, Asha, I want to also give Ophelia the opportunity to speak as well.
Yeah, go ahead, comrades. Ophelia, did you want to make an input?
Yes, yes, yes. I'm sorry, I didn't hear who the question was directed to. I think I touched a bit on this in terms of, I think there has been, I don't believe that there can ever be a leaderless movement. I think there's different ways of mobilizing, particularly because we have seen that, activism in Africa is under threat. Not just in the environmental space, but just globally. Leaders are targeted and killed. We have a similar scenario here in South Africa with one of our environmental activists, Umam Figile, from KZN. Umam Figile was brutally murdered, and the accused of the murder is it has to do with her dealings with the local mine. And there's a number of women who have been through the same thing, who have been either killed, women in Kolobeni, or who have either been threatened with rape. And I think it's quite important for us to even in the big movements to sort of decentralize power, because we have seen that the new agenda is to target activists and to take their lives. And when that happens, it can also hinder activism. And I think there's so many ways that we can work with this in terms of in terms of mobilizing. That we don't appoint someone who's going to attract all the attention to themselves, but we have different people taking leadership position at grassroots level. And I think that's ultimately what needs to happen as we go along and build movements, or rather as we go along and build social movements, because there has been a lot of attack on activism globally. It's not just a South African thing, but with South Africa we do have a recent example and a number of stories as well of other activists who have been targeted.
Asher, any final comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other panelists made really great points. I'll maybe say one or two things. I mean, I think there's a particular way, I think, in this contemporary moment, where a lot of movements are becoming NGOized. And there's this discourse that disturbs me around Black excellence, which gets caught up in this kind of idea of leadership. And, there's all these kind of funded programs for like become a leader. And all of this, I think, is putting forward models of I think it's creating a class of people that are kind of removed from the mass of people that they organize and work with. And this idea that Black people need to be excellent, or whatever that is, which is kind of an extension, I think, of that kind of talented 10th discourse, which is an elite thing. And so I think that there's this kind of, I mean, the spaces that I work in, we don't really speak about leaders, or we don't have much of a conceptualization of that, partly because of a critique of this, the contemporary tendency, and which we see as disturbing, around this kind of cult of leadership. But also I think there's, I mean, sometimes it becomes, I'm not sure how we disentangle some of these things around what is leadership and what is it when people are just doing work. You know, a lot of the spaces that we organize in, like the cultural space we run, there's no leadership. We have a completely flat structure. Certain people just show up and do more work than others, you know, which is a different structure, which is a different kind of organizing structure to if you're organizing kind of a march or like a movement in a different kind of sense. But I think a lot of the time, the idea or the figure of the leader is just the person who's doing certain kinds of work, and often that's more visible and that's kind of classed and gendered in particular ways. But I guess I come from a place of more of a critique of the idea of leadership than a desire to rework the concept or something. But yeah, understanding that there's multiple ways in which people have organized in the past and will continue to do so. But I think that, yeah, the idea of leadership to me is not one that we organize with on a daily basis.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our wonderful first group of speakers. I want to believe that the rest of you watching got so much out of it as I did about the fundamental ways that we think about leadership, and even questioning and critiquing this formulation in the first place. We heard some powerful things just in this last round of comments about the need to decentralize power and to think about our political formations in a fundamentally more participatory fashion. And so we will have an opportunity to welcome our speakers back at the very end, but now we are preparing to transition to our next round of 2 speakers. And so I will just thank Asher, Othalia, and Bofelo for your wonderful commentary, and then we will see you very soon at the end. So I would like to welcome another moderator to this conversation. Yonela, are you there? Yonela, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, I think we can hear you.
Hello,
Yes, we can hear you. So
yes, I'm here.
I will just welcome. Let me just introduce.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
I'm here, but I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you. So I'll just introduce you.
Great.
Wonderful. So Yonela Boya is a young Black man who believes that Africa will one day return to its former glory. Ashe to that. He is a writer and a poet and has volunteered with many initiatives and organizations, including Ibokusini Solutions and Afronia. And so I should also mention that Yonela has been a huge part of making today possible, with helping to recruit speakers and to connect us with so many wonderful people who are doing such important work in the struggle. So I'd like to just invite Yonela to introduce our next speaker, especially as we transition to our current area of conversation, which is about Black power in Black consciousness in community work. So please take it away. So we might be having some technical issues. Yanela, are you able to?
Thank you, Sister Crystal. Without any further ado, I think I'll just jump into introduce. Can you hear me? So yes, the next speaker that is going to be with us is Dr. Bababuntu, who is an activist scholar who has worked in the space for African youth and community empowerment for a number of years. He is the founding director of Eco-feminism Solutions, a community-based company focusing on the practice of decolonial Black power and Pan-African cultural revival since 2002. Thank you.
Pan-African greetings to everybody. Thank you so much, Yanela, for the introduction. And thank you so much to the organizers, my co-speakers, and everyone who's tuning in to this very, very important conversation. I know that time is a little bit of a problem for a number of reasons. So I'll try to be close, be even shorter than 10 minutes, which is difficult because we are discussing big, huge issues. But I'll try my best. So as introduced, I work with and for Eco-feminism Solutions, a community-based company. We draw very strongly from African indigenous knowledge. We base our vision and operation on a decolonial pursuit or objective. We draw very strongly also from the legacy of Black consciousness, and we work with Pan-African principles. I think to say something about the practice, for me, it's very important to make these ideas that we often discuss in quite academic terms, at least when I say that, I mean that when we speak to the general communities, we run the risk of using language and terms that people are not necessarily familiar with and do not directly speak to the reality the way they see it. And through that, we create hierarchies of knowledge, hierarchies of power, hierarchies of who should speak and who can articulate the struggle. So for us, it's very important to, without simplifying the very problematic aspects and the many layers that explains our oppression, it is important to also speak in ways and engage in ways that become very collective and collectively owned, not just masses of people who sit and listens to leaders or follow leaders, but actually people who get involved and do the work for at least in a similar direction. I don't think we can always expect to work exactly the same way and exactly the same direction, but in a similar direction, agreeing on a few points for us to move forward. So I will draw from the practice of our organization. So we are a small company, small organization, small entity. And when we say that we are community owned and based, it means that we work through and with communities. We are a community of practice in itself. And that means that there's three fundamental aspects to our work. Number one, we are a home. Myself and my wife, the number of children that are part of our household and the extended family, play a very significant role in creating an entity that is homely. And I'm saying that to say that many of us who are drawn to issues of injustice and racial trauma and many of these problems that some other people in our community say, why are you so busy with these things? Why can't you just see past these things? Part of the reason that many of us cannot see beyond and be oblivious to many of the problematic aspects of society is that many of us also come from experiences in life that have marked us in certain ways. So for us, home and family is a very central revolutionary unit in the struggle and in the implementation of solutions. And I know that that's quite different to other entities because other entities may put the first emphasis on how you struggle and who you struggle against. And family is not necessarily based on who you struggle against. It's about who you protect and who you govern and who you provide leadership for, and who you serve, who you are there for. So it's quite a different approach to the first steps into what our practice or our understanding of practicing Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism is. And let me also say that we have never really been busy trying to look for the ultimate way of looking at this and then spending a lot of time criticizing and hacking down others who have a different approach. We have just found ours, and we appreciate and we think it's so important that others see it different ways, but that we still, despite of the differences, can find ways of working together. And even this meeting, there's a number of people on this platform. I'm not going to take the time now to send out to call out the names, but even within this platform, we work very strongly with entities both in South Africa, in Nigeria, and a number of other countries as well. One thing that is important for me to say about working and operating within South Africa, I think it begins with a very deep, to understand South Africa, it begins with a very deep understanding of the Black psyche and the African spirit, and what the effect of generations of racial trauma is. Cultural terrorism, spiritual genocide, because there's so much destruction that has created layers and layers and layers of non-existence and non-being and powerlessness. Yet South Africa is shaped in this idyllic presentation, which means that within a continental sense, South Africa is seen as one of those spots where you want to be, where you want to go, where you want to study, you want to work. There's money in South Africa, there's opportunity in South Africa. Yet it is also the most powerless place on earth, in the sense that those resources that do exist in this country are not accessible to the majority of the country. And when you can actually visit South Africa for a week or two, and you might not even see that, depending on where you go, depending on who you engage with. And I think that's very important to understand, because South Africa is strange in many places. It's quite extreme in many ways. So when you have kind of digested that background, for us, I think our focus is really to build a completely new cadre of leadership over time, meaning that we understand that it's not something that we can do quickly. So it means that over generations, we need to mold a different understanding of what leadership is, what serving this continent is, what it means to work for Mama Africa, what it means to bring Mama Africa back. And I think I would like to explain what we do through quoting Fanon. I'm sure many of us know the quote that often he is quoted with: each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. I have very little time, so I don't have time to go into the details, but I want to just pause a little bit on the relative obscurity part, because that is very true. And I think for generations, we have seen young people come into their consciousness through that relative obscurity. What is my mission? Oh, things are not the way that I thought it was. Oh, things are not the way that I learned in school. Oh, things are not the way that I learned in church. It's a lie. And now I'm waking up, and now I want the whole world to know. And this kind of happens in each generation to some degree. Of course, there are examples in South Africa where people have really been able to come into a movement and build on their predecessors or those who worked before them's shoulders. But very often young people come in and experiencing themselves as the first people who actually discover new truths. And we want to come in and be that and change that relative obscurity part. So we want to change that to relative clarity, meaning that as a young person, you should have a place to tumble around a bit, because that's what it does to you when you are shaking up your notions and knowledges and understanding of this incredibly multi-layered, oppressive world. So with Ebukusini, you're not forced to take a particular stand, follow a particular ideology, have to align yourself to a very narrow understanding of what must be done and what your vocation should be. And we do that because we also want to position, alongside with a very clear political Black consciousness position, we also want to position a very clear need for spiritual growth, for spiritual consciousness, for deepening ourselves into the indigenous knowledge of this continent, which I feel we very often bypass in radical political spaces. And I think there are conflicts and different dynamics within the two orientations, but for me, we cannot really even move forward unless we find a way to bridge them. So how do we do this then? And to just say something short, I'm giving myself a minute. I hope that's okay to round this off. For in our understanding, it's to build awareness and consciousness and practical change through African-centered education, which means to us, it means education and learning processes outside of institutions. So we spend a lot of time going out to communities, sitting with communities, understanding certain dynamics from leaders and those who guide communities, but engaging young people. And I find that across the continent, what many young Africans have in common right now is that many feel very marginalized, very misunderstood, but are also very ready to ask the difficult questions that generations before them, including myself and those before me, have been very afraid to ask. And I think that gives a lot of new potential. Secondly, leadership development, and I'm aware of the discussion that we're having on the forum as well on what does leadership mean. Maybe I can come back to that. But for me, leadership starts on the self level. Can I guide myself? Can I understand myself? Can I anchor myself? And I think for me, it's very important to also work with multiplicity of ideas, because if you understand African spirituality, it means that there cannot just be one model for everything we do that is supposed to fit everyone. So once I understand my vocation and my purpose and my being, I might have to carry myself slightly different than the next person. And then that means leadership within what I govern might sit and position itself slightly different from the next person. Third part is to engage in experiential learning, dialogic action. We believe very strongly in dialogues. And we see every single day, for instance, we have a men's program, we have a women's program, we have a children's program, we have a youth program, and we have family programs. And we see actually every single day that, just to mention an example from African men, so we set up dialogical platforms for African men to talk, to engage, to listen to each other without bringing in an expert who's going to tell men what they should do. What I find so profound with us as African people is that many of us actually know what we're supposed to do. We're just afraid. We're just so full of fear for the potential that it brings if we actually have the clue, if we actually have the answer, if we could actually govern ourselves and take over the ownership of this continent. So for me, crushing that fear and destroying that fear is a very, very, very fundamental aspect of building leadership. Very lastly, there's a term that we use called practical Pan-Africanism. Practical Pan-Africanism. And that means that the practice we do must be holistic. It must have many legs to stand on, and it means to make our historical experience our vocation. I thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to the continuation of the discussion. Thank you very much. Black Power.
All right. Thank you, Baba Buntu. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
We are hearing you.
All right. All right. So do we have any questions to take, or I can just move on to introducing the next speaker?
Yes, please. The next speaker.
All right. So our next speaker is going to be, oh my God, I hope I pronounced this well. Our next speaker is going to be Nomagugu Loma from Black House Collective. Nomagugu Loma is a member of Black House Collective, which runs literacy programs in South Africa townships that seek to empower the Black child. She also runs a program in her township, the SYP Dlamini Reading Club, and recently began conversations with Africa to close the gap between academics and Black people at ground level. At this point, I would like to welcome, you have to correct this name when I'm done, Nomagugu Loma, so that I'll be able to pronounce it next time. Thank you.
Namagugu, are you there? You're muted currently. So you can just unmute. I think you can start speaking. We can hear you. Namagugu, are you there? Namagugu, I think you can start speaking now.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, can I continue? Okay, I'm going to continue. As I have been introduced, my name is Nomakuku Hloma, and I am representing Black House Collective and Conversations with Africa. And I am going to be talking about educating the Black child on Black consciousness as a tool for survival. I'm going to contextualize our work. Black House Collective is an organization that houses the Black consciousness philosophy and certain programs that are centered around liberating the Black person and liberating the Black child. And one of those programs is Siapambili Youth Pioneers, and it was formed by Sisters Zandi Khatebe and fellows in May 2008 in Soweto. The aim was to empower the Black child, whose quality of education remained questionable even in the post-apartheid dispensation. It established a mentorship program, debate and public speaking competitions, and reading clubs for younger children in townships in South Africa. The aim, as I've said before, is to liberate Black people, especially Black children. Black House Collective runs, amongst a few other programs, a children's educational initiative called Lugotjwa Lusemanzi Saturday School for Children. And it's a Xhosa word. Lugotjwa Lusemanzi is a Xhosa word, which basically means it's easier to teach a child or a person when they're still younger. The relevance of Black consciousness in post-apartheid South Africa. Black consciousness, as espoused by Bantu Steve Biko, is the very act of bringing the Black man back to himself, or the Black person back to their original state of being. And it is very, very critical for post-apartheid education and for the child, for the Black child in post-apartheid South Africa, because we believe that Black liberation was not achieved in 1994. The negotiations were a major compromise on the part of the Black person, and they led to a falsification of freedom. Therefore, the need to rally together in attempts to fully bring the Black person back to his or her higher state of being. This is the only way that meaningful freedom can be achieved. And the starting point for SYP and Black House Collective is educating the Black child. We analyzed the post-1994 situation in South Africa and understood that there are a lot of shortfalls in the education system, especially for the Black child. And we tried to locate the Black child's position and found ways that we can empower the Black child. And the starting problem, besides apartheid, besides colonization, is the Bantu Education Act of 1953 that was later renamed the Black Education Act. It led, or it enforced, racially separated facilities and systems. So basically, the type of education that white people received during the time and the type of education that Black people received was different in terms of quality and in terms of infrastructure. It aimed at directing Black people to the unskilled labor market. In other words, it aimed at creating out of the Black person a Black body in terms of a non-thinking being, a being that is only important for the labor or for the system of white supremacy and for the benefit of that system. The quality of education, of the education curriculum and institutions of Black people was quite poor during apartheid. The act was repealed in 1979 and replaced by the Education and Training Act of 1979. But it still maintained the system of a racially segregated education system, even though the Department of Bantu Education was eliminated. Segregation in the education was formally ended in 1994 by the introduction of the interim constitution. But the problem is not so much the segregation amongst Black and white, but the quality of the education provided to Black people. Schools in townships and rural areas remain death traps for African children post-1994. The infrastructure in township schools and in rural schools remains quite poor. There is often a shortage in teachers or educators, and there's also a shortage in learning materials. Besides citing the official end to segregation, there is no valuable improvement in the quality of education experienced by the Black child in this country. Therefore, it is critical that Black people take it upon themselves to educate the Black child holistically. And this is where really SYP and Black House Collective has come in. Why is Black consciousness a tool for survival for the Black child? Educating the Black child about Black consciousness is critical for not only their individual survival, but that of our entire race, because we cannot really lie and say the war is over. We remain in a racial war in South Africa and perhaps in many parts of the world. And it is critical that we teach the Black child where they are within this war and how they can empower themselves. True love means knowing yourself, and more importantly, knowing your enemy, so that one day you can find a way to overcome your oppression. When given correctly, when given incorrect information or certain parts of history omitted to suit the oppressor's narrative, education can be detrimental. So one of the challenges that we face as young activists in South Africa that work with children in townships and want to educate children in townships is that most children in high school or in secondary education are quite illiterate. You can mentor a student that is in grade 10, but they cannot read or write. They do not even understand basic parts of speech. And this is very sad. And that is really our starting point. We begin by teaching them the basic parts of speeches, basic literacy, actually. But education is not simply about being able to read or write, but it is also about being able to think critically about your situation, about your identity, and about your broader position in the world. And this is why we offer education, but with Black consciousness. So you cannot just give the Black child plain education. You give them education that is going to empower them in a world that is anti-Black, in a world that seeks to annihilate the existence of the Black person. Therefore, it is significant that this education for survival be Afro-centered. When done in larger numbers, we can possibly create a powerful generation, a generation that is more conscious of their identity and their place in the world, a generation with possibly fewer to no compromises. And part of compromises for the post-1994 generation would be something that you guys touched on in the first discussion, and that is xenophobia. As part of really our education program, that there is no such thing as xenophobia in South Africa, but there is Afrophobia. And I think in order for us to contextualize these discussions, we must put them in the right context, and that is what Black House Collective and SYP want to do in South Africa. Black people are afraid of themselves. Black people are afraid of what they could be, because xenophobia is defined as the fear of the unknown. How is it that we do not know ourselves? So this is the type of education that we offer our children. It is holistically, it is empowering, it is Black conscious, is African-centered, and it really brings the Black person to themselves. So with this type of education, we can achieve a generation that can read and write. This is very important for African people, but that can think critically. And that way we can be one step closer to our complete and meaningful liberation. And I want to end this discussion, because I do not want to take very long, with a quote from a very important post-1994 Black consciousness movement, the Blackwash movement of Azania, with their slogan. And I'm going to end it by saying, indeed, we are the ones that we have been waiting for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Nomagugu, for such an incredible and clear-headed set of remarks, and just a reminder of, as Baba Buntu also emphasized, how important the work of self is, of cultivating our consciousness of culture and community as the root of and the route to liberation. And so we are so grateful for such a wonderful program this afternoon or evening, as the case may be. And we want to have some space for questions and comments from the wonderful people who've been joining us this afternoon, as well as a way of sort of tying all of your presentations together. And so I just wanted to highlight a comment that I was hoping Dr. Babuntu and Nomagugu can perhaps start us off with, and then we can open up for the other panelists if they would like to contribute. But Calvin thanked all of you for a brilliant conversation, and I'd also like to echo his gratitude for really wonderful comments. And he said that he would be interested in deepening the conversation about the role of the arts. And I think we can also add the role of culture, particularly in the ways that our speakers have been discussing the role of culture in the history and also the possibility of Black autonomy. So if Dr. Baba Buntu or Nomagugu would like to comment a bit more on the centrality of the arts and culture and the work that you do and Black people possibilities for freedom and autonomy, we would love to hear from you.
Okay, my comment is short, if it's okay that I go first. I'd like Nomagugu to actually speak more extensively on this. But I think across Africa, what I see a lot of Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism in young people's art, whether it is called consciousness and whether it is produced in spaces that are regarded as conscious spaces or not. And I think that speaks to the power of what art does to the mind, to the being, to the presence. We are a people that have been scripted out of history, so scripting ourselves is very, very important. I just think what I'm worried about is that art is also a space that is being invaded and colonized, even in its articulation of freedom. So you have Americanized ways of looking at art. You have an over presence of courses and guides and internet connections that kind of guides you as an artist and makes you latch on to certain ways of expressing yourself. That becomes cool. You get a lot of like on social media, and you are seen as a cool artist, and you start to get followers, and that also start to direct where art is going. I think we still need artists who are very clear on going their own ways and speaking for a particular purpose. When I say speaking, I don't mean using words necessarily, but speaking for a particular purpose of pushing us forward, creating that momentum that gives us the courage that we need, because we are really, really bound by fear. And I think that's one of the vocations of an artist, to make us fearless. Thank you.
Nomagugu, are you able to or interested in responding?
Can you kindly repeat the question again?
Yes, so the question is a fairly open one, but one where we would love to hear more from you about the role of art and culture in the history and possibility of Black freedom and autonomy?
Okay. I really believe that art is quite significant for articulating our interest or our need for freedom in the whole world. I feel we cannot really talk about Black liberation in academic spaces or in spaces that are quite serious, in the form of poetry, in the form of music, in the form of graffiti, in the form of drawing. We can narrate our story as Black person. We can give our side of the story, and we can really talk about our need for liberation in a fun way, because art is fun, art is lively, art is easy. It's not really easy coming to communities and people and really talking serious languages and talking about white power and Black power or white supremacy. But when we come in in a very artistic form, it's easier to penetrate environments that aren't really easy to penetrate. So I feel art is very central to education. It is very central even to Black liberation. So it's a very interesting conversation that I feel would need to expand on. Yeah.
So the comment was actually initially directed towards Asher. So Asher, if you would like to comment, and also any of our other contributors, including our wonderful moderators, we would love to hear you on this question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I think it's a good one, and I think there's multiple levels on which we need to kind of think about it. I think the first is to despecialize how we speak about art. There's often this way in which we think and it's part of, I think, the problematic that Dr. Baba pointed out, which is around the trends within the art world in this contemporary moment, and the kind of capitalist social relations that are kind of shaping that space, which have obviously been there for a long time, but there's a particular way in which Black art, even in that space now, is gaining a certain kind of trendiness, which presents a certain kind of threat to depoliticizing, I think, real politics. But I think that there needs to be, a despecialization of art and artists, and I think that artists, should be organizing along with everyone else in a certain sense. But I think in the sense of its importance, I think people have always come together around music and other kinds, whether it's poetry readings or whatever. So I think these activities remain an important aspect of us getting together and building a culture of coming together. At the end of the day, any form of revolutionary movement we build will be based on a collective. So in the sense of people coming together, I think this is something really important. And I guess my ideas historically on ideas of culture come largely from Amilcar Cabral, who speaks about the importance of cultural resistance, is that any liberation movement will always be based on that. So the liberation movement goes through so many different chapters. At times this is armed resistance, at times it's political, other times it's carried by cultural forms, so and basically what he says is that a people that has their culture, or is articulating and developing their culture, can never fully be dominated, because that those cultural practices, that cultural tradition, is what will form the basis of a liberation movement. So I think it's important to continue inventing, continue pushing our own traditions forward, and because I think that's the basis of our struggle, and I think that's partly also where BC, part of the shift that BC enacts from becoming, not just a political movement but a cultural movement, is the insistence that the movement, a central part of it, is articulating ourselves autonomously, and I think cultural work plays a big role in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asher. And also thank you for elevating the teachings in politics of Amilcar Cabral, which are still as relevant as ever. Are there any other of our speakers or moderators who would like to comment on this?
Language and create a rehumanizing, liberating, and emancipating language so that we do not take the dominant language for granted. For an example, in South Africa, post-1994, you find the use of the concept of foreign national, which for me, the language of the establishment itself then addresses xenophobic attitudes. Because for me, a descriptor of people, of the citizenship of people, you are either a citizen, an immigrant, or a naturalized citizen. The minute we start to talk about foreigner, for example, then it generates particular feelings. So I think it's a role of an artist to challenge the discourse and create a new language. And I'll speak briefly about some of the initiatives that one is involved in. We created a dance drama called Beyond Boundaries, which was challenging actually xenophobia and looking at the structural, institutional, and systemic arrangement that create xenophobia. And as part of the Black Consciousness Movement United, we started an initiative that's this year called the Festival of the Oppressed. So where we bring people together, where we have discussions, poetry, drama, dance, theater, and focusing on doing away with these identities of colors, Indian, and so on, and trying to make sure that this festival of the oppressed bring all the oppressed people together to express themselves through the media of art. Another initiative of Black consciousness activists in Freedom Park is something called Community Literacy and Numeracy Group, where what they did was to organize after-school classes for kids in the township. But part of it is that every Friday, they organized a political school. And on Sunday, there is performances. So the requirement for people to participate in the Sunday performance is that they must attend the political school on Friday. So without imposing any agenda of what people should sing about, what kind of poetry they should write about, but the political schools have enriched the vocabulary and the insights of the people who end up performing there. So this is one of the interventions key interventions that we do around arts. It's the Festival of the Oppressed, as well as it's an open mic kind of a situation where you can do poetry, dance, everything, but the requirement is that people attend the political school where they are taught about the history of South Africa, of Africa, and the interconnections between people. And one of the things that art can do is to connect the dots. For an example, one of the challenges that when we look of the struggle, whether it is the struggle of housing, whether it is education and so forth, it is important for us to look at the manifestation of the challenge locally, regionally, continentally, and globally, so that we can explore organizational forms that reflect both local dynamics, regional dynamics, continental dynamics, as well as global dynamics, so that we can see points of convergences and points of divergences, so that our struggles are not isolated. And I think art can play a pivotal role in that.
Thank you so very much for just helping to really consolidate so much of what has been shared amongst our conversation, within our conversation today. So we are going to start to close out since we started a bit late. We are so grateful for you all sticking with us through some of our technical challenges. And I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Nanre, to offer our final question and invite some closing remarks from all of our contributors today.
Thank you. Such amazing conversation. Thanks so much, everyone. So the final question is, how do the movements you work within build Pan-African solidarity? And how can we further enhance Pan-Africanist networks globally? And if everyone can just take, a very short amount of time, less than a minute, to answer that question. And I would love for, I don't know if Yonela to also hear us, because both Yonela and Nanikan were supposed to be helping us facilitate, but due to some technical issues, it's been quite challenging. So I just want to offer them up some space to be able to speak before we continue, before our moderators give before all our panelists give their final remarks. Yonela, are you able to speak? I think one of the ways to build Pan-African solidarity is to create our own network, internet networks that we can all access easily without relying on all these terrible providers. Yonela, are you there?
Can you hear me? Can I get an indication?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you, but if you can hear me.
We can hear you. Okay, well, maybe we'll come back to you if you're able to speak towards the end. Nankinan, would you like to make any remarks?
Can you hear me now?
All right, can you?
I'm really sorry about this inconvenience that I'm called.
Sorry, should I go on?
Yes, please.
All right, I think it was a wonderful session. I barely heard anything because the second I begin to hear something, I just hear crack, 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 crack. It's really terrible. Yes, like you were saying, I hope one day we're able to create our own network because these ones, they are not really fun. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I think basically I haven't been able to attend the other sessions, but I think it's a very wonderful series that we've started because one of the things I've been shouting a lot is we need solidarity to be able to do these things, move these movements forward. So I'm hopeful that even beyond the Sunday school sessions, we keep up a sort of conversation that can help us from different ends and different corners to see how we can help move Africa and the world generally forward.
Thanks so much, Nankinan. So I guess we'll just go around. I'll start off from the beginning. So we'll start with Otelia. Otelia, you can go ahead with your closing remarks.
I think it's quite important for us to within the socialist movements to kind of understand that we're at a point where climate change is something so big that we really need to incorporate in our own politics. I think for a very long time, there has been stats that are coming out, suggesting that, especially where South Africa is sitting now, suggesting that with the increase of temperature, we are more likely to see more violence. And this can be directly connected to the femicide rate in South Africa, and also saying that, the way the increase of violence is affecting everyone in South Africa, we really need to now start having climate conscious conversations. And those climate conscious conversations need to include African people, because at the end of the day, African people will definitely be the ones who are more vulnerable to climate change. So I think for me, in closing, I would really like to say that we need to start conscientizing ourselves around issues of climate change and how climate change will definitely affect, the Black working class in squatter camps, even in urban areas and even in rural areas, because these direct links that I'm talking about in relation to climate change are definitely going to affect us first due to issues of environmental racism. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say in closing. Thank you so much for this beautiful platform. I really think that we need to really continue having such conversations because they are inspiring, and we really need to now start connecting our struggles with other movements, because Black Lives Matter globally, and unfortunately, Black people are at the bottom of the ladder. And I really think that we need to start elevating this conversation, not just on social media, but after this call, maybe we should also take it to in our own communities, because these are really important conversations. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Asher?
Yes, thank you very much, comrades, for inviting me to be part of the conversation. I really enjoyed it. I guess in terms of the movements that I'm working with to build Pan-African solidarity, a significant aspect of some of what we've been doing has been to do African history education with social movements, like participatory kind of popular education based African history. That is, I think one of the first steps for us has been to kind of learn, to have a better sense of the history of the rest of the continent, as a kind of way of reaching out, even just mentally, and then beyond that, we've been building relationships with activists in Namibia and Botswana. A few years ago, we did a youth tour with, youth camp over a couple of weeks with activists from South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana. So where we can, we try to bring people together across kind of borders, but we know that that's not in the day to day, that's not really financially viable, But I think part of imagining like a model of solidarity, I think, being able to invite each other, whether it's across neighborhood, across city, across the country, or across borders, to kind of spend time with and teach each other how we are organizing and have people contribute from other places. I've been able to come to Egypt basically through that kind of work, to come and support some autonomous work going on here, where these comrades set up a college after the revolution, to kind of extend that work, and I think if we build projects and are in doing this kind of work, it becomes easier to kind of bring someone into that process. And so I think to go back to Cabral, he said, what's the best? Someone asked him, what's the best way to resist imperialism? What's the best way we can send solidarity? The best way to resist imperialism is to do it where you are, and so I think that building where we are and being able to support others in their project in whatever ways that is, I think is important to me. Yeah. But thanks for having me, everyone. Yeah. And to all the other panelists and hosts.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll go to Lani. You can make remarks, your closing remarks. for a minute, please. Baba Fellow.
Okay, I think one thing that we have to emphasize is the need for Black people all over the world to create spaces for exchange of ideas and which are centered around practical work that is being done in communities in different forms of struggle so that we can learn from each other and reflect collectively so that we can enhance our insights. And for an example, I would like to see an initiative such as Festival of the Oppressed, for an example, not taking place not only in South Africa, but taking place on a continental scale, either face-to-face or virtually, where you can be able to share literature, dance, theater from different parts of the Black world and be able to engage with the socio-political environment and material conditions that informs these works of expression of social reality through artistic forms of expression. And the other thing is for the social movements from the Black world to find a space and a platform where they can be able to come together to reflect collectively. And like I've said before, this must not be just theoretic engagement, but it must be based around sharing specific programs that we are doing, whether it is the Black House Collective identify similar program that in Nigeria or anywhere else and say, what can we learn from each other's practice? I think we need to be able to build unity through action and reflection.
So I think we actually lost Nanre, but I will take up the baton and pass it on to Dr. Baba Buntu for your remarks on how you are working through and with Pan-African solidarities in the work that you are doing.
Thank you so much to the organizers and fellow panelists and also participants in the conversation. This is very, very important. And my 2 cents, to not repeat what the beautiful comments that have already been said, I must also say that I've had terrible experiences with us coming together from different parts of the world in a great frenzy. But because we lack what I would call revolutionary fitness, 2, 3, 4, 5 months down the line, everything goes so sour that you'll be actually appalled and shocked. The mudslinging, we are not used to each other. We're not used to work collectively. So for me, what I'd like to add to this, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do what I just outlined, but I'm just saying that we often stumble with it and we struggle with it. So for me, I like the comments that have been said about doing something within our communities. Many of us are based in cities and spaces where there are a Pan-African community. There are communities of Africans from different places. Do we see each other? Do we even care? Do we even know what women from Somalia go through? Do we know, do you understand? Do we take an interest? And when we have youth rallies, do we invite young people from across the board and different nationalities and backgrounds? And I think until we do that, I'm not sure if we can really do a lot on the international scale, at least as big groups of people. So let's start exactly where we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yonela, are you back and able to offer your remarks? Yonela, are you there?
I hope so. I really hope so. I really hope that I'm being heard right now as I speak. These technical. Yes, I'm speaking.
We can hear you.
Can you? Yeah. going to is, even though I do not have any surety that I'm being heard, is to just, just thank the organs. I think one of the things that could be done and is being done to increase Pan-African networks is such a platform, reaching out to Black people, African people all over the world, creating a space where we are exchanging our insights, our thoughts, our ideas, our struggle. I think that is something that will go a long way in the long run, and it should be something that, if possible, should be sustained, and should be able to have some platforms like these, and I just wanted to just say that, to thank the organizers, and that such platforms are what we need to create more and extensive networks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yanela, especially for the way you've persevered through so many technical difficulties. So we're grateful that you were able to rejoin us, and to offer some encouragement and affirmation. So we would like to invite Tone now to offer some remarks.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This has been such a pleasure. The question was asked of, how do we continue this work? It's by literally doing this work, picking it up. I'm a volunteer member of all of the organizations that I work with. Also, someone described, talking about popular education, creating space and infrastructure. That all begins with Black consciousness, right? Black consciousness is how Malcolm Little not just became Malcolm X, but how he learned to embrace other Malcolm Littles throughout the world and nation and move them towards this level of consciousness. And that's our task. So we don't need permission to embrace our Black consciousness. We should be fearless and undaunted in doing so. And I believe we can. And platforms like this begin to be that spark. So continuing this effort, and hopefully it inspires others to do the same, and thinking very Pan-African. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for allowing me to be a member.
Thank you so much, Tone. So I'd like to turn it over to Nanre.
Yeah, so I'm going to read Mama Google's remarks, and then I'll just say a few thoughts. She says, the need to rally together as Africans is more critical now. May we find new language to articulate our struggle against oppression, and may we reach our final destination, together as one united nation. Community activism at grassroots level is significant in all our communities, at home and in the diaspora. It's those little initiatives that bigger outcomes will come about. May we always remember that we are the ones we have been waiting for. Black power. And that's why I'm so inspired by now. So I can say, oh, I'm so inspired by young people with such clarity, and so it was very apt that I come after her. I really don't think I have so much to add, but it's just been such an amazing opportunity over these past weeks to start to organize something that looks like a vision and a dream that we've had for so long, and that is, how do we rebuild Pan-Africanist solidarity? And as I said, in the last conversation, we've been offered a very unique moment in history, and I truly would love that our history would be written, that there was this major pandemic and the whole world shut down, and it led to the revival of Pan-Africanism, perhaps with a new name and a new force. But I think it's definitely, hearing from these activists on the ground, the local work is so important. The organizing work, from each community is so integral to this. And at the same time, the larger, broader, bigger work of together of crossing international boundaries, just like our forefathers and foremothers did and our ancestors did, in creating something that's even larger and more powerful than what we can do in our individual communities. So again, I thank you all for your presence, for your contributions. Learned so much today, and just look forward to continuing this initiative, and look out for us in 2021. If you're interested in joining us, just let us know. Shout out. And we have so much work to do, so many other countries, and we'll also hopefully be crossing across different topics and ventures in 2021. Hello. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you as well. I want to join the affirmations that so many of you offered. And I also just want to remind us of where we've come from in this process and in this experiment called the Pan-African Activist Sunday School. As we mentioned at the beginning, this started out of urgency because of an extremely urgent need to show up in solidarity for grassroots organizers in Nigeria who were facing extreme forms of suppression and violence at the hands of their government after rising up for a number of weeks to demand justice, to demand accountability, and to demand anti-Black violence that is still anti-Black violence, even when Black people are the ones who are the perpetrators. And so, we started from there with an effort to show up in solidarity with our comrades on the ground. And from there, we've really grown, and we are going to continue growing to truly try to embody the principle of solidarity in practice, not just as a theoretical or symbolic idea, and to really cultivate space where more of us can learn and connect and share, because it is not just an intellectual exercise. We are all over the African world. Wherever Black people are, we are fighting for our lives. And so we have a duty to show up in this moment, to band together as we have done for so many decades and centuries of our struggles. And one final thing I just want to add as well, and really uplift that several of our speakers have really emphasized, and I think is worth re-emphasizing, it's that we have an actual responsibility, and we have a need to transition from the symbolic and the theoretical to the practical. I know, at least in the view from the United States, I've seen just in my lifetime a stark decline in Pan-Africanist sentiment. When I was a child, there was far more identification with an African consciousness, right? Or even an understanding as of oneself as part of a larger world of African people. And we know that this is the result of white supremacy, right? To silo us into nationalities, to make us sort of not understand the realities of our experiences, right? And I also look to elders who came into their own, political consciousness and their own political organizing work in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. And you see that these elders have the kinds of broad Pan-African experiences that are very hard to find today with young people. Growing up in a city like Philadelphia, where I'm from, and finding yourself at the, Pan-African conference in Tanzania, traveling the communist world, going to South Africa, to Angola, to so many places that Black people are, and being able to connect on a one-to-one level. And so I think, this is part of an effort to reconstitute those possibilities. We are not physically with each other, but thanks to technology, even though it's not perfect, we are able to see each other. We are able to regard each other as more than symbols, to understand that to say one is an African is more than just an identity and a moniker. It is rooted in so many complex histories and experiences and struggles. And so it is I know this is also Nanre's hope that this format can help to support such a process of moving into practical Pan-Africanism, which Dr. Bababuntu offered to us earlier in our conversation. And by way of closing, I do just want to say that this is only session 3. And I know I've learned so much. And we are very much looking forward to 2021 being a year where we can deepen our analysis, our connections, where we can reach out to and amplify the work and the perspective and the political analysis and knowledge of more of our diaspora and more of our world of African freedom fighters who are working towards collective liberation. And so we've already had so many ideas from you all about the kinds of topics you would like to see. Some people talked about women in leadership. We've talked about imperialism. We've talked about the issue of sanctions. I think we've heard here today eco-feminism and things that deserve more time and attention. So we hope that you will rejoin us next year as we bring more of these sessions to you all. So on that note, I would like to just thank you all for watching. We've had tens of thousands of people actually around the world who've joined us in just a matter of weeks. And so we look forward to connecting more with you all. And so you can reach out to us on our platforms if you would like to offer a comment or to connect with us. And we will see you in 2021. Thank you.